Hello, my name is Garvin and I read things and natter about them on the internet for your entertainment. So, this will be my last, call it, official video of the year, and I do want to thank my ever-wise patrons for their support and patience. As always, I will note that you can join their ranks for as little as $1 a month and get votes on upcoming content. There should be about 3 polls for you to vote on as of this video. There's a link in the description below. This week, we're continuing our look at Babylon 5 with the unofficial history of the Narn Regime. Now, for those of you who don't know where I'm getting this is from the Narn Regime Factbook from Mongoose Publishing, who created a Babylon 5 RPG game. This history is non-canon to the television show, so just be aware, and let's dive in. The earliest prehistoric Narn dwelt in caves, living in small family groups, and they survived mostly on hunting. However, there was a shift in the global climate, with many stating that this caused widespread global flooding, although in the book, that's a subject of dispute. Either way, this global climate shift forced the Narn from their caves, and they not only built their first stone freestanding structures and began to move around on the surface, but they had a shift in diet to include more plant life, and this would set them on the road to developing agriculture. This would also lead to what Narn called the Gathering Time. During the Gathering Time, the Narn family groups would encounter each other for the first time and begin to form larger groups, becoming clans, tribes, and then tribal confederations. And according to Narn tradition, while there were skirmishes and violent events, most of this time was largely peaceful as groups combined for mutual safety and support. And most of these mergers were accomplished not through armed conquest, but through diplomacy, adoption, and intermarriage. Now, this wasn't without problems, as the isolation of the Narn family groups meant that each group had their own diseases, and when these groups intermingled, these diseases hit people who had no antibodies against them, and the spread of these diseases would claim many lives, but the Narn as a whole survived. At the end of the Gathering Time, according to tradition, every Narn was a member of 7 great tribes, each tribe more or less functioning as a separate and independent nation with its own culture, religion, and traditions. And that's when the trouble started. It was primarily the differences in religion that drove the new wave of Narn conflict, as each of the tribes had enough land to grow food, but a full belly doesn't heal injured pride. Each tribe felt that the other tribes were disrespectful of their gods and traditions, and the anger from that festered and would flare up into bouts of violence that were each worse than the last. The elders of the 7 tribes met quietly to try and figure out a way to end this that wouldn't involve mass slaughter. What emerged was this revolutionary religious idea, the 7 made 1. Claiming divine revelation, the elders told their people that through visions, they had come to understand that all of the gods and goddesses of the 7 tribes were aspects and avatars of a singular manifest god. Now, the elders had expected a certain amount of resistance to this idea, but it spread like wildfire, and to their shock, the Narn people quickly embraced this idea of all deities being one. It has been suggested that the Narn people were honestly disturbed at being this violent to each other, and were already looking for a way out, and were happy to find a way to embrace one another that didn't ask much of them beyond, hey, just put the blades and the torches down. So with the edges of competing traditions safely blunted and sort of intermingled, if you will, the tribes themselves began to mix more readily, and this led to more intertribal marriages, decreasing the blood boundaries between the tribes, and the tribes began to cooperate more and more until the boundaries kind of became non-existent. And the result was a period of peace and stability that, as far as I know, has no equivalent in Earth history. The tribal elders would unify their governments into a single council, and the Narn lived at peace. And according to tradition, almost everyone was happy. What happened next was the appearance of the Narn telepaths. Now, this didn't lead to violence like it did for the Minbari and the humans. Perhaps because at this point, the Narn had been at peace for generations, and just maybe the Narn don't like killing each other as much as some other species do. Either way, while fearful at first, the Narn came to the idea that these mental powers were a blessing from their gods, who chose to grant them to their treasured children. So, the telepaths quickly became not just a new religious caste, but gradually took over leadership roles from the tribal elders. And on top of that, the telepaths would actually be the ones to take the first steps to spread literacy, creating universal education systems so that for the first time in their history, the majority of Narn could read. This left the Narn ready to enter a golden age of learning and plenty. But something beyond the stars had different ideas. 2,000 years after Narn had been unified, 1,000 years before the opening of Babylon 5, an alien darkness came to Narn. A race older than the very species of Narn, or humanity for that matter, set up a base on the southern continent of the planet to wage war on other species that were already space capable at the time. They would have ignored the Narn as being too primitive to be worth paying attention to, except a delegation of Narn telepaths came to greet these obviously advanced beings. This elder race was known as the Shadows, and they assumed the telepaths were the minions of their enemies, and not only wiped out the peace delegation, but unleashed their soldiers on the Narn race, launching a pogrom to wipe out all the telepaths and their blood relations as far as they could be traced. This led to entire cities being wiped off the map with no survivors. The Narns found themselves being hunted by invisible wraths that would stalk them during the day, and then they would be hunted by nightmares that scoured their minds during the night. Within weeks, 1 out of 4 Narns were dead, and only 100 telepaths were left alive. However, the Narn did not give up. There was an elder Narn who had been part of the delegation, who was a non-telepath named Jilon. And because of that, he knew where the shadow base was located. And he had a tactically gifted protege, who was a visionary Narn named Jaquan. Together, they rallied and hid the remains of the telepathic population and pulled together the regular Narn, using ambushes and attrition tactics to isolate and kill shadow minions, steal their weapons, and learn how to use them against their enemies. The Shadows were sorely pressed in their war amongst the stars at this point, and they just weren't able to pay enough attention to the Narn to put them down. Instead, the Shadows decided to resort to stealth and trickery, attempting to fool the Narn by staging a, quote, final battle, unquote, where a single Shadow led a large army of their minions, basically sacrificing itself to make it look like the Narn had forced them off while preserving their base. Given that the Narn already knew where the base really was, this ended up only providing the ever-growing Narn resistance with more weapons and battle experience. And Jaquan, Having slew this Shadow General would create a suit of armor from its skin. Just for those who don't know, shadows have a sort of exoskeleton. So this dude went mano a mano with a being that was older than his civilization, killed it, and made armor from its exoskeleton. I'm not gonna lie, that is pretty metal. I respect that. Jaquan led the Narn resistance to the Shadow Base, to the true last battle, and it was brutal. It was the powers of the Narn telepaths that proved to be the deciding winning factor, however. During the clash, the Shadows focused on evacuating the planet, but they weren't willing to leave without a final goodbye, and plus they wanted to erase as much of their technology as possible, not willing to come back in, say, 1,000 years, I use that number for no reason, and find out that the Narn had reverse engineered their tech and now were their near equals. So when the Narn seemed posed to break the final lines of defense around the base, they triggered a bunch of fusion bombs. Meanwhile, the Narn telepaths told Jaquan that they had had a vision of the future of a surprise attack from the rear and sent Jaquan and his command troops far to the rear to fend off this rear assault that never came. So instead, Jaquan and his command post would survive, and while Jaquan would be half blinded and heavily burnt, he would live, although the vast majority of his army did not. This left the Narns grieving and outraged and feeling that their gods had betrayed them and allowed this to happen. In their rage, they destroyed what few shadow artifacts survived, and Narn society began to fall apart. They had won, but they lost faith in their gods. They lost faith in their traditions and way of life, and they had nothing to replace that, and nothing but their rage, which had no target but each other. So now they stood ready to tear each other apart. Jalan then stepped forward with the revelation that he had met a being of pure light that shared with him a way forward. Jalan and Jaquan would lead a reconstruction, unite the Narn, and soothe their wounds, pointing a way forward that didn't involve turning on each other. It took years to gather up the tattered remains of the Narn people and rebuild their homes, but it was accomplished. And once again, there was a great age of peace and plenty. In this age, the Narn let go of their rage and they forgot their fear. They built a great planetary capital called Varot, a walled city with enclosed farms almost 70 kilometers across. It became the heart and soul of the new Narn nation. But once again, beings from beyond the stars would have different ideas. Thus came the Centauri to Narn. Once again, an alien race reached down from the stars and would bring only terror and loss. The Centauri landed openly and were greeted with open arms, and they responded by slapping slave collars, literally, around Narn necks. The Centauri brutally crushed Narn for 70 years, but the Narn resisted. The breaking point came during the burning of Kaldor Rift, when the Centauri governor gathered the entire population of a work camp for the mine that had played out, and using a ship, burned them from orbit. 10,000 Narn died during the bombardment, which was bad enough, but he also broadcasted the event so that every Narn on the planet could see it. His thought was that this would break the Narn, and force them to accept the yoke. Instead, the Narn would secretly form what would become the ruling body of the Narn regime, the Kha'Ri. The Kha'Ri did not leap into action. Instead, they restrained the Narn people, and for 10 years, they abandoned their usual resistance tactics, lulling the Centauri into a sense of security while they studied Centauri technology, habits, and tactics. Because they knew they would only have one shot at this, so they were not going to miss. The Kha'Ri would shoot their shot during what is called the Night of Bleeding Stars. They struck across 5 different worlds in a coordinated assault, slaying thousands of Centauri. In response, the Centauri Emperor ordered the Republic fleet into action, and through a combination of planetary bombardment and special forces missions, 1 million Narn were murdered in response. The Narn would only escalate their violence, using captured Centauri equipment, however. Every time a Centauri unit was lost, that would mean more guns and more equipment for the Narn, and for every Narn that fell, 10 more were ready to take their place. This was bad enough, but the Centauri were also facing pressure from several non-aligned species, and realizing that the military could only be in so many places at once, the Centauri withdrew from Narn and several other nearby planets that the Narn would come to occupy. The withdrawal was haphazard and badly managed, and the Narn found even more equipment that they could reverse engineer to build up a military force to ensure that no one would ever occupy Narn again. Driven by the need to make sure that no hostile force would ever set its foot upon Narn home soil, they became determined to expand. They also needed more living space, as the Centauri had environmentally devastated their homeworld, as well as needing resources to create and fuel their war machine. That need for resources to fuel that war machine would lead them to reoccupy the homeworlds of several other races that had also been ground under by the Centauri. And while the Narn would not enslave them, they would strip those races of any self-government and treat their worlds as subordinate colonies, thus bringing themselves closer to becoming like their abusers, the Centauri. However, not every race in the galaxy was as vulnerable. When the Narn attempted to annex several Gaiam colony worlds, they were quickly and soundly defeated, their vessels disabled, but the Gaiam allowed them to withdraw, keeping the casualties down. A race known as the Kha'Ri were not so gentle, utterly destroying any Narn force they found in their space with no survivors. This convinced the Narn to give diplomacy a chance, and they found out they could fund much of their military expansion by selling captured Centauri arms. The last conflict that the Narn would actually fight was a brief conflict with the Earth Alliance. And they found out that despite the fact that they outgunned humanity, humanity was simply more tactically skilled in the Void, due to having more experience in space warfare. The Narn had beat the Centauri on the ground. It also didn't help that Earth prioritized its logistics during its space expansion, and Narn logistics simply weren't up to resupplying their losses so far from home. So this led to the Narn choosing to withdraw and solve their conflicts with Earth diplomatically. During the Dilgar War, a major war that I cover in my Earth Alliance videos, the Narn proclaimed neutrality. Although several facts would come out after the war. There were allegations that the Narn had provided some aid to the Dilgar in exchange for weapons and other technology. On the flip side, it also came out that the Narn had several colony worlds hit with biological weapons that had been developed by the Dilgar, and it turned out that Dilgar had decided to use these Narn colonies as sort of testing grounds for later wars, which enraged the Narn regime. So most people kind of just shrugged off any allegations of the Narn working with the Dilgar, pointing out, hey, the Dilgar actually hit these guys with engineered plagues. That's not something you do to somebody who's your friend, or even an ally. At this point, the Narn had been a space-going power for only a few decades, but it had become one of the major powers of the galaxy, and it was widely respected, and in some areas, feared. The Narn, however, remained laser-focused on the goal of revenging themselves on the Centauri at all costs, and ensuring the Centauri would never abuse them again by destroying the entire Narn race down to the last child. Much like the Centauri had done to the Zon, and for much of the same reason. It is on that somber note that I'm going to stop this video, as any further events actually take place during the Babylon 5 television show run, and I want to encourage you to watch the show. It's really good. Old, but good. That said, I hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If so, please comment, leave a like, or even consider subscribing. All these help me in my eternal struggle against the Dread Lord Algorithm. Dare be on his name. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest Patreon supporter. I hope you're still enjoying these videos, man. So, just as a heads up, I may be releasing some bonus videos, but I will be stepping away for the most part, and we will resume our regular release of videos on January 24th. I hope you'll be there. Since this might be my last video of the year, I do want to just say something real quick. I know a lot of us have reason to be afraid as this year ends, and I want to say I'm truly sorry for that. So, do what you have to do to be safe and take care of yourself. In addition, I want to remind everyone we're only going to get through this if we work together. So, even if you're not someone who may be vulnerable soon, focus on being a good neighbor and do your best to help and take care of each other. Don't lose hope. Don't give in to despair, because apathy and despair are the greatest tools of the enemy. And of course, keep learning and keep growing. Keep reading.